Hey Mark, great to have you on the call.
Good morning, Atif. Great to see you.
Yeah, it's been a while, and we're hopefully looking forward to having a great conversation about Canada's role in the energy transition, and perhaps a bit of an update on what's happening there on the ground. But before we do that, it'd be great for me to quickly introduce you, and then perhaps you can add a bit more background to it. So, I've known you some time. We've worked together, and you're based in Canada, which I think is obvious for everyone watching by now. Um, you've been involved in international energy advisory and infrastructure advisory projects for decades. You've worked across Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, and probably other places as well. You've seen the energy systems change, and you've been involved at very high levels in advising on that, advising on attracting private sector capital, on reform, on improvements, etc. And also, you're an entrepreneur, and you've been involved in various projects during the years, and a good friend. I hope I covered most of it.
Sounds good to me. I like it. Thank you very much.
Anything to add, or have I pretty much hit the nail on the head?
I think that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, we had a few exchanges, and what I was really interested to bring to your attention is, I read a very thought-provoking article recently in the FT, and it was titled something to the effect that should Canada be bigger, or should Canada have been an economic powerhouse, or something. It was a provocative question, with the implicit assumption that Canada is way below its potential, and just bullet pointing where they're coming from with that. They sort of say, well, its location, next door to the world's biggest power and economy. It's got 40 million people. It's very richly endowed with critical minerals. I believe, if I read correctly, it's got the world's third largest oil reserves. Hopefully I'm right there. If you want to correct me, anybody, stick the comment in.
All
Yeah,
sounds about right.
yeah. 40 million people. And yet the comparator is it has a GDP in purchasing power parity terms, PPP, lower than Turkey's. So can you give us a bit of context there? Do you understand that perspective? And is Canada below its potential?
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, and I think a lot of those points that you mentioned are probably correct. Growing up in Canada, I live in the center of the country, in Manitoba, and the capital city here is called Winnipeg. And the way I describe it is if you were playing darts and you were using North America as your dartboard, and you got a bullseye, both north, south, and east and west, you would hit where I live. It's not necessarily, an economic powerhouse of a city by any stretch. In some respects, sort of like what you're talking about with the entire country itself. But in terms of geographic location, yeah, it's spectacular. We're a shipping place that can move things not just across the country, but across the entire continent. And of course, in terms of the Northwest Passage, if that ever opens up, which may happen, unfortunate as a one potential fortunate result of global warming, that could certainly also improve shipping routes and potentially make Manitoba and Canada much more prominent in the whole global shipping space.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think you're right, and in terms of Canadian economic potential, one of the things that I always used to look at when I used to travel is people would talk about Canada, and we're famous for being friendly people, being well liked and nice people, and we enjoy a very good reputation that way globally. We tend to be well respected, and it's a very great thing to be Canadian when you're traveling on a Canadian passport. You're welcomed everywhere you go, and we really are thankful and appreciative of that. But in terms of, even one way I would look at it, Atif, is even just brands. When you look at the US, you can, name endless number of brands that people recognize on a global level. You look at countries like Italy and France and these things, and the list of, brands from cars to fashion to food to everything is basically endless. And Canada, just on a global scale, we're really not known even for a lot of brands, you know, from an economic standpoint. The ones we would stand on, like in the past, used to be BlackBerry. Unfortunately, that's sort of gone away for the most part, but we were very proud of BlackBerry back in the day. And then now I guess we've got Lululemon and Crown Royal whiskey, but really there's not a lot of other global brands that we're
Justin Bieber, huh? You gave the world Justin Bieber.
yeah, some people are thankful for that, and some people aren't. But we still got Celine Dion and Bryan Adams. And when South Park isn't making fun of us, they at least do recognize that we've done this. Oh, and Drake, I guess, is another big one.
Yeah. Fantastic.
But definitely, you know, given what we have in terms of resources and you know, our lifestyle and things like that, we don't have a lot of big exports that we're famous for. I mean, we do a lot in the grain space and renewable energy and things like that. But in terms of a brand and an identity on a global level, you know, that does tend to be absent, and it is somewhat curious, to be honest with you.
Okay. So just leveraging onto what you're saying, you mentioned the number of industries and you were kind of, I guess, explaining why we are where we are, and perhaps reiterating that, okay, the potential is higher. So if I just link it into the energy transition, because that's where there's a lot of interest. That's where the world is kind of moving. A lot of investments going in and policies, etc. So before I delve into the higher potential of the kind of energy transition, what Canada can offer, what is the view from Canada of renewable energy and what is it doing? I mean, you mentioned Manitoba, and the first thing I think of is hydro, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And very popular resource both here in Manitoba, Quebec, Ontario, and other parts of the country, Newfoundland as well. We've always been very, very proud of renewable energy here in Canada, and we've been using and developing renewable energy and exporting it for many, many years before it was really, let's say, as fashionable as it is today with solar and wind. We do have a lot of wind potential and a lot of solar installations throughout the country, and companies like Canadian Solar are fairly large on the global scale when it comes to that sort of thing as well. Not to plug a company that I work for now, but Decibel, we're producing a home energy station, which is a solar inverter and bidirectional electric vehicle charger that provides backup for whole home backup for homes. We're very excited about the potential of that, and that's going to be marketed globally and internationally. So I think you'll see more in the coming years with some of those types of products. And like I said, the reputation for these sort of things, for producing good, clean, renewable energy, right, and that to the world.
Okay, fantastic. I mean, definitely on the innovation side that you picked up on, that's pretty interesting, because I mean, the world needs to integrate these renewables. The world, if we really want to electrify the transport, we need to make sure we have these smart bi-directional technologies in place, make it a seamless customer experience. It's great to hear that Canada is putting its kind of innovative skills to bear there. I'll come at this another point, because from an international perspective, I mean, one of the reasons we're discussing this is even from outside Canada, the view is that you guys have huge potential, and sometimes for that potential to be leveraged even more, the kind of stars need to align, the geopolitical policy time of the world kind of stars need to align. So with this global energy transition kind of moving forwards, with the geopolitics, with BRICS, with China, US competition, EU competition, etc. There's a focus now on Canada, especially after the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, is that it is a massive resource base for critical minerals. It has a established at least mining industry and know-how. There are a lot of Canadian companies specialized in the mining and development sort of sphere. And because of all the incentives and subsidies available, there's now a massive interest in onshoring processing and refining parts of the industry for mining in Canada itself, rather than just pulling out the ore and sending it somewhere else. And you have, in particular, Canada itself and the United States on the doorstep. So from your perspective, is that what you're seeing on the ground, and is that the potential you see as well? And what else?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we are a very, very mineral resource rich country, but we do have some issues here, and they revolve around a number of things. One of them is just the sheer size of the country. It's absolutely massive, and the population density is incredibly low. So you have tons of areas that are mountainous areas. You've got a lot of climate conditions to deal with in the north, where it's extraordinarily cold. And we simply don't have, when you look at a country like the US, our neighbor to the south, the road network and the weather play very well into the hands of economic development and shipping routes and things of this nature.
Right.
Even within Canada, to fly from coast to coast, I believe we're crossing 5, maybe possibly even 6 different time zones, just across this entire country. It's staggering. People don't even realize it. And even, based partly on geography and the location of lakes and things, for me as a Manitoban to drive from Winnipeg to Toronto, which is in the neighboring province, is about a 24-hour drive just to go to Toronto. I can fly there in maybe 2 or 3 hours.
Right.
But the road network, might have to go through the US and around the Great Lakes, things like that. It's very, very complicated to move things in this country. And as a result, small businesses that want to do shipping, for example, within the US, look at Amazon Prime and these sort of things, and everything ships for free. US Postal Service and all the different carriers can ship product very, very inexpensively throughout the continental United States. In Canada, conversely, it's actually very expensive to ship things around here. And I think some of these concerns sort of stifle some of the growth. You have the vast majority of the population living within 100 kilometers of the Canada-US border.
Okay.
And that's because that's where the business is in the US, because the economy is massively larger than ours, and the population is roughly 10 times the size of Canada. So that's one of the primary drivers. But the second thing is the weather. And we do have some incredibly brutal weather here in the north, and that is really something to contend with. It's virgin territory in many cases. It's absolutely gorgeous. We have tremendous wildlife. The water resources in this country are second to none. I believe we have 20% of the world's freshwater resources contained within this country, and by far the greatest number of freshwater lakes in the world. I think we're number one in the world for freshwater lakes, with almost 1 million freshwater lakes, and I think the U.S. is number 2, and they might have a fifth of that. So, and water, as you know, is becoming, well, it always has been, but as time goes on, it's going to become an even more crucial resource to the world. And I think, that's one of the areas in the future that I see Canada really excelling on, is the freshwater resources.
Okay. And obviously, maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, but it was really sad news to, see all those wildfires, etc. Because, have you got any snippets on that, how it affected you as a nation,
Yeah, I mean, all of us, I think, are impacted in one way, shape, or form, but with family and friends. The wildfires this year were absolutely devastating and burning completely out of control in many provinces. British Columbia, Alberta, a number of them were very hard hit. You could see the impacts all the way down. I had friends in New York City that were sending me pictures and saying, thanks for this, you guys, and jokingly. And they said one great thing Canadians always are good at is saying sorry for everything. So everyone was apologizing for it. My province was spared by and large by the impacts of these fires directly. But it was strange. It was almost eerie, because you would go out in the evenings for a walk, and you would see, as the sun was setting, the sky was blanketed in smoke, and it just creates a very strange and chilling kind of atmosphere.
Okay. So so that Mark, that brings me on to a more and I appreciate that. Like I said, it was I thought about you when I saw those. I thought, okay, I should contact Mark, even though maybe I didn't, but I should have done it earlier. But I think things have calmed down, but we pull lessons from it A bit more of an outward-looking question then, in the sense that, yeah, we discussed. I mentioned your background at the beginning of our call and how you've got all this experience around the world. So apart from the rich kind of minerals and hopefully the ability of Canada to, to whether it's copper, whether it's rare earth elements for magnets or whose names I can't even pronounce unless I read them from the periodic table, whether it's aluminium or lithium or whatever. I think, yeah, clearly because of that proximity and what we discussed earlier, the IRA, there's this big potential and opportunity for Canada into the US. But also, as you've been doing, you've been from Canada, you've been helping utilities and governments and around the world. So can you give us a bit of perhaps a concluding remark on how Canada can further contribute to the energy transition around the world? And maybe you can touch on more on this technology that you mentioned earlier as well. Just an open question. Yeah.
I think we've got a lot of expertise in that space. We do have a very clean energy sector by and large here in this country, and we do have a reputation in the past. Many provinces in the past used to export their talent around the world to do this sort of work. That's sort of cooled in recent years because there's been sort of more of a focus by a lot of the state-run utilities on core business as opposed to the export of talent. But I think that in terms of product and manufacturing, some of that is really starting to pick up, and we're starting to export more of those things. I mentioned Canadian Solar and Decibel. One of the things that Decibel really is targeted at is, sort of kickstarting this whole renewable energy transition in the US and really using your electric vehicles. And one of the, a lot of people really want to move towards solar, but one of the biggest challenges with solar is it's an intermittent resource, as you know. And what really is required in order to make it more usable for everybody is storage technology and batteries. And you talk about rare earth minerals and these sorts of things. Obviously, there are a number of shortages and a lot of concerns about producing batteries. And so one of the things that this product does, which I think is really fascinating, is it leverages the batteries that are already in your driveway if you have an electric vehicle.
Okay.
So if you were going to buy a battery for your home, for example, you might buy a 10 or 15 kilowatt hour backup battery for your house, but you may not realize it, but in your vehicle, you might have 4, 5, or 6 of those already sitting in your driveway, and you're only really using them for one thing, and that's transport. But while that vehicle is sitting there idle in the evenings, it can be used to store energy. It can be used to push that energy back into your home so you don't have to use energy from the grid. And it can be used to sell energy back to the grid and also provide additional capacity for communities and utilities as it moves back into that grid. And there's a tremendous amount of storage that is really locked up in those vehicles today, and that is going to be unleashed by a device like this that's really going to kickstart making that solar energy that's generated throughout the daylight hours more usable at other times. And specifically in places where the grids are overloaded, like in California and different parts of the US and eventually other countries, as we move into them, you can really start to have backup potential from this as well, so that you can continue to work, your internet doesn't go down, your food doesn't spoil in your fridge when you have power outage events, which are becoming more and more common as the grid has to take on more load and demand from electric vehicles and other such things.
Gotcha.
So I think one place, obviously, Canada will play a big role in the future with these sorts of things. And this company I'm working with now, the primary market for this is the US, because they're accelerating that energy transition. You talked about the Production Act and all of the incentives that are being targeted in this particular area. And of course, the power outage events that states like California and others are experiencing on an oftentimes very regular basis now.
Awesome. And I'll get a link from you for Decibel, and we'll stick it in here for people to have for me to have a look at, as well as other people to have a look at. Final question from me, Mark. I myself have had this strong focus on particularly the global lithium industry. It's kind of like the new thing to talk about. Maybe the next one is uranium, but that's for another day. Now, as with any technology, as with any change, there are obviously the doubters, there are obviously the naysayers and the opposers. In short, what is your view on the ground from what you see in Canada, at least, and maybe other places, in terms of the pace of adoption of electric vehicles?
In my honest opinion, Canada as a nation, I think, has been slow, compared to others. You look in a number of European countries and you look in the US, there's been a lot of incentives targeted in this space, and there's been a lot more uptake. You even look at China and these places, and things are moving a lot more quickly. I mean, potentially one of the reasons for that, and we talked about this earlier on, is that what brands is Canada known for globally? Well, I can't really list any popular electric car brands that you'd be familiar with. There are some little startups like that, but I do imagine that if we had, 3 or 4 companies that were producing electric vehicles, Canadian electric vehicles, and I think we definitely start to see a lot more uptake, because those companies feed back into government policy, they feed back into drive incentives, part of national pride gets involved, and you start to see these things happen. And, I think, when you talk about Canada and its potential, I guess there's one thing I'd like to mention. Years ago, I attended a lecture one time, and there was an American there giving a lecture, and he was comparing Canada to the US. And he asked a similar question. And he said, why is the US so much more ahead than Canada when it comes to economic development and a player on the world stage? And this one person, it was just his opinion, but I thought there was some truth to it. He said Americans are more bold. And there's different ways to look at that comment, but the point is that they do go into things a lot more with a lot more vigor and with a lot more energy. And Canadians, we tend to be a little bit more bashful, a little bit more shy, a little bit more tempered in our approach to things like that. And there's some really good things that come with that. I mean, I think our country is focused a lot more on lifestyle. We have, we're much more focused on things like healthcare, and I would argue education and families, and providing these things to people in more of a social context than, in a much more capital intensive context that the US focus. But those sort of things that like capitalism drives things like GDP and those sorts of numbers. So I think that's one of the reasons why Canada is maybe lagging behind other countries in this particular regard. That said, as a Canadian citizen, I do believe we have a lot to offer and we can do more, but we also do value our education, our family time, our country, and our I wouldn't even call it more of a national pride. It's almost, we're more thankful to be Canadians as opposed to we're proud to be Canadians. And I think, that's a cultural thing that helps explain why we haven't realized that potential to the same level that you might expect. And, that this article that you read may have mentioned.
Okay. That's actually really fascinating. And I think a good note, good place to for us to end. I think it's a really nice message, because in a lot of these discussions, we don't cover that softer aspect, the underlying values. It's not just a monetary value. There are other values there. And that's really interesting. Concluding comment from me, Mark. Earlier on, you were mentioning things about the EV industry, etc. So all I can say is, when we have our next discussion, I look forward to you telling me about your new EV startup and how it's all progressing. And
definitely, and I can't wait to share it with you, and hopefully some great stories about how Canada is moving forward in that space and on the global scale.
Great, fantastic. It's great to see you, Mike. It's been a while, like I said, and it's good to connect like this. Thanks for sharing your ideas, and let's do it again. Like this. If not, like I said, I'd love to do it in person as well.
Fantastic, Atif. Great to see you, man.
All right. Cheers. See you soon.
Cheers. Bye. Thanks.